So thank you very much for having me. It really is an honour to be here. I was first sat at this conference back in 2020, just before the world got crazy, and I learned about the basics of stereoscopic displays from the late, great Dr. John Merritt. And so it really is an honour to be back here presenting some of the work that I've done since. So I'm going to be talking about human performance using stereo in an HMD. But my real focus, I'd like to point you towards, is that association with individual stereo acuity. And we're going to be exploring why that is important and how you measure it. So standard disclosures, all these views are my own, and I have no conflicts of interest. So I'd like to just take a moment to explain the motivation behind this work. So historically, aircraft are analog in nature. They require just a pilot using their eyeballs in an aircraft to view the real world. However, since those early days, cockpits and aircraft have become far more complex. We're putting far more visually demanding systems in the cockpit, such as helmet mounted displays, HUDs, head-up displays, HMDs, and as we've already heard this morning, boom operators are using stereoscopic displays in the cockpit. So it's a much more visually demanding environment. Our test methods to select aircrew and support them throughout their careers have not changed since the Second World War. So one of our key questions is, in light of the changing digital environment of aviation, do we need better, more updated vision standards and tests to optimize human performance? Now, my work was specifically focused on helmet-mounted displays, HMDs, and the reason why HMDs are becoming increasingly used in aviation is because they give an added capability to the pilot. They enable the pilot to keep their eyes out of the cockpit, so they're not having to look back in to look at crucial flight display information, particularly during operations like flying in formation close to other aircraft, air-to-air refueling. If you're flying in combat, you really don't want to be taking your eyes away from the targets, from the objects, to look back inside the cockpit. So you can present information to the pilot regardless of the orientation of their head. Furthermore, if paired with sensors and a head tracker, you're then able to project a virtual image inside the HMD, representing the outside environment to the pilot, which is particularly useful in a degraded visual environment, such as flying at night or flying in cloud when you have no real-world visual cues. Now, HMDs come in 3 different orientations, either monocular, where you have just one optic to one eye, biocular, so the same image is presented to both eyes, or binocular, where you have a slightly different image presented to each eye. And it's the binocular orientation is the one that you're then able to create a stereoscopic image and present stereo 3D. Now, the majority of HMDs currently and historically are monocular and biocular. There pretty much are no binocular HMDs out there, okay? But there is a desire in the future to use binocular HMDs in aviation. Now, why? Why would we use binocular HMDs? What added benefit would they give you to the benefits you already see of just using an HMD? Well, based on its use in other applications, stereo 3D in a standard display has been shown to declutter information. So it gives you the ability to stand out one bit of information compared to everything else on the screen. It's been shown to more efficiently capture attention, to improve search times, reduce response times, and reduce perceived workload. And some of those studies have been done on surgical research using 3D displays. So my work in particular was looking at human performance with stereo 3D as a warning alert symbol, so popping out a warning alert symbol to the pilot in an HMD, and looking at how that affected their performance, but not only that, how it affected their cognitive workload, and both measured objectively and subjectively with questionnaires. Okay, so we've spoken about binocular HMDs. So it's really important then to talk about binocular vision of the human user. Now, I'm not going to labour this slide to this audience because hopefully you should all know a little bit about stereopsis. Stereopsis is the ability to perceive depth by fusing two slightly disparate images to give you that perception of depth. But its stereo acuity is the measurement. So it's the smallest disparity that can be measured and it's a way of measuring binocular vision in humans. There is a bimodal peak in stereo ability in the population at about 90 arc seconds and 700 arc seconds. But crucially, up to 30% of the general population are stereoanomalous. That means that these people predominantly rely on monocular cues to go about their day-to-day life. Is this a disadvantage? Is this a disability? Well, most of those people probably don't even know that they are stereoanomalous. They'll rely on monocular cues, but monocular cues are far more open to misinterpretation. So if you're trying to judge the depth, your distance from a tree, you have to know what the average size tree is to be able to then interpret that. And then that can be open to misinterpretation because if it's a new tree, it might be smaller than expected. Whereas stereopsis is based on geometry, so it's a much more hard cue for depth. And it has been shown in a variety of different studies that people with better stereo acuity normally are better drivers. They're more accurate in their hand-eye coordination. Professional baseballers and basketball players traditionally have better stereo acuity than the normal general population. And while it's not absolutely necessary for flying, as evidenced by some monocular pilots out there, it is linked with better flying abilities. So if you have good stereopsis, it's likely that you're going to be a better pilot. And some research that's been done shows that landings performed monocularly are steeper with greater descent rates, and a lack of stereopsis has actually been shown to have caused some mishaps, some accident crashes in the past as well. So stereopsis is useful. So in the military, it is a mandated characteristics in our pilots. So we want to make sure that we test for it to ensure that our pilots have it. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, let's look at the standards. So I'm just going to highlight the two that are pertinent. So in the UK, across all of our 3 services, pilots must have a stereo acuity of better than 120 arc seconds. In the US Air Force, that's 40 arc seconds, but that's pretty easily waverable to 120. What are those figures based on? Your guess is as good as mine. That's just how they are. They're not rooted in evidence, but they're incredibly difficult to change because it's just how it's always been. And at the bottom, the standards, the different aeromedical policy, tell the medical examiners what tests they need to use in order to achieve those results. And these are some examples of the types of stereo tests that some of you may already know about. And we'll just go around them in general. But they are largely based on actual depth cues or paper-based. So just going across the top, the Frisbee-Davis test is a real depth stereo test where you can see the star one is popping out towards you, and it's really prone to monocular cues. So if I were to sit there and move my head around, I can use some motion parallax to work out which one is the odd one out. The Titmus test as well is an odd one out, just like the Air Force vision tester, which is used by the US Air Force. I mean, sat here, you can already get down to that third line, working out which is the circle that's popping out towards you. So based on a 2D screen, I can already give you a measurable stereo acuity. So it's an inaccurate result. It's giving me a false positive result. It's telling me that someone has stereopsis or a measurable stereo acuity when they don't. The T&O test is what we use in the British military, and the Verhoeven stereopter is another form of, like the Howard Dolman, that uses real depth cues that the user has to move in and out towards them. So TNO test. This is a paper-based booklet that uses random dot stereogram, which is considered the gold standard of stereo tests because it doesn't have any contours and you're less likely to have monocular cues. But the TNO test, taking that into consideration, you're still going to get poorer results with the TNO test because the difference in luminance with the color anaglyph glasses makes your stereopsis worse. It's cheatable. There is one booklet. If I really, really, really want to be a pilot and I'm really motivated, I can buy a booklet on eBay and memorize the answers. And I'm telling you right here, right now, pilots do that, okay? They want to be a jet pilot, ain't no one standing in their way. Okay, so it's cheatable. It has a floor at 60 arc seconds. So the best stereo acuity I can measure is 60 arc seconds. So it's only got 4 levels. 480, 240, 120, and 60 arc seconds. So I'm only ever going to be able to lump you into those 4 categories. It relies on having the right environment, the right lighting, and also the printing quality. If you've got the same booklet in your medical test center that's been there for 20 years under sunlight, it's going to have faded. And so it's not going to be, you can get differences in the printing quality. And you have an examiner bias. The examiner takes down your result. Did you really say right? Did you? So it's open to giving you false positive results. So in the OBVA, in the lab, we have developed digital vision tests to try and combat some of those limitations seen with paper-based test methods. So this is the digital random dot stereogram that I used for my research. So you can see the setup here. Sat a meter away from a 3D screen using active shutter glasses. And we created, so the stimulus was similar. We created a digital version with static disparity. So the observer had to input on a control pad the orientation of the missing piece of the circle using static disparity. And then we had a dynamic one, which on each frame refresh, the dots would appear and disappear. So it appeared that the dots were constantly moving around, and that really eliminated any monocular cues. So we had the 2 versions of the random dot stereogram, and then for comparison, we used this stereo search test, which has been developed by the lab beforehand and has been shown to positively correlate with aviator performance on a stereoscopic simulation. And what it was looking at is you have one circle that pops out towards you in depth and one that's uncrossed in depth. So it's not just a simple spot the odd one out. You have to be able to differentiate crossed and uncrossed disparity. So we were looking at 4 stereo tests. Each of our participants took all 4 of the stereo tests and they did that twice. So you've got the TNO test. You have 2 versions of the random dot stereogram, a static and a dynamic, and then the stereo search test as well. And we'll go straight onto the results. So just to remind you, we had 43 participants, and they took all of these tests. So it's the same group of people in each line. The red dotted line is where that 120 arc second standard is for our aircrew selection. So the smaller the number, the better your stereo acuity. So everyone to the left of the line would pass and is allowed to be the top gun, and everyone to the right would be rejected. And it's pretty clear straight away that the TNO test on the bottom, you've just got 3 groups, because that's all I can characterize your stereo acuity as. We have our digital tests then going up, stereo search test, the static one, and then the dynamic random dot stereo acuity. So for the same individual, I've got 4 different stereo acuity scores here. So they differed significantly. So which one do you trust? Which one do you use? Well, we'll come on to that later because you want to look at which one predicts performance as to you make your decision on which one is going to be useful. But the reason why we probably see the slightly higher thresholds with the dynamic random dot stereogram is because you're forcing people to recompute disparity every single frame refresh. So the top line is the one least likely to have any monocular cues. So in our opinion, the dynamic random dot stereogram digital version of the test is likely to be the most accurate representation that we can achieve in measuring stereo acuity in our users. It's important then to look at retest reliability. And these are bland Altman plots that are used to test the reliability of a repeated test. So for the 3 tests, the T&O and the 2 random dot stereograms, we plot the difference between the first time you take the test and the second time you take the test. Because what I'm trying to do is, if I take a test, I want to be sure that if I take it a second, a third, a fourth time, I'm going to be getting similar results. What you don't want is a test that's really variable. And to try and interpret these, the smaller the standard deviation, the closer the blue lines are together, the smaller the difference between the first time you take the test and the second time you take the test. So the closer the blue lines are together in the digital random dot stereograms tells us that those digital tests are more reliable than the T&O test. And to put that into context, if someone scores 120 arc seconds on the T&O test, their true stereo acuity as measured by the digital tests can vary anything from between better than 60 arc seconds to worse than 280 arc seconds. So it's not giving you an accurate accurate measurement of what that individual's true stereo acuity is. We then looked at comparison correlations between the tests. Do they agree with each other? And really we're using the benchmark with the stereo search test because that has previously been shown to predict performance. And we can see on the right-hand side that there is good correlation, significant correlation between all of the digital stereo tests. They all are going in the same direction. However, with the paper-based test, there is absolutely no relationship whatsoever. And that's expected because, as we've already spoken about, the paper T&O test can only give you 3 answers. So to summarize this part of the research, digital tests give us greater granularity, better definition of what an individual's stereo acuity is. They are more reliable and repeatable, and they eliminate cheating, and they don't give you any operator interference. And they can also measure to threshold. We're using an adaptive psi algorithm, a psychometric function. So if you're getting answers correct, the disparity gets smaller and it gets harder. If you start getting them wrong, then the disparity gets bigger to give you that threshold measure rather than just a course pass-fail. Okay, so now we've established the stereo acuity of our individuals. Now we want to see if there's any effect of using stereo in an HMD. So this is what we created in the lab. We have a 270-degree horizontal field of view flight simulator. Then that gives you the out-the-world picture. We actually had some software flying over Hawaii, so I got to know the island quite well, but still never been. We had 43 subjects, and they would sit 2.5 meters away from the screen in the chair in the middle, and they'd be wearing an HMD. The lab does have a research grade F-35 helmet mounted display, but for ease of publications, we used a commercial off-the-shelf HMD. So it's a see-through prism-based HMD with 100% binocular overlap. And this is what the individuals would see inside their HMD, overlaid onto that real-world flight simulator. The warning symbols would pop up in the center left of their display, and the warning symbol would say either flap or fuel. So it wasn't just a simple response time. They had to identify the warning symbol and then differentiate between if it said flap or fuel. They then pull a switch with their left hand, either for flap or with fuel. But obviously we had to keep them. We didn't want them just looking, waiting for a warning alert symbol. So we created this quite complicated flying task. So we'd give them a command location. So we'd give them a heading up in the top right, and we'd give them an altitude. And then in the flight simulator, we would have to fly to that command location using the heading indicator at the top and the altimeter to the middle right. And obviously we had practice sessions where we trained them up to do this. We were looking at performance metrics for correctly responding to the warning alert symbol, but we were also looking at measures of cognitive workload, measuring peripheral skin temperature, heart rate, and heart rate variability, and subjective measures of cognitive workload in the form of symptom questionnaires and NASA TLX cognitive workload scores. And we'll go through the 4 conditions that we had for the experiment. In the control 2D condition, we had both warning symbols, flap and fuel, flashed on and off at 1 Hertz. And that is how a warning alert is currently displayed in an HMD to the operator. For the other 3 conditions, the flap warning symbol would continue to be flashed on and off at 2D. But the fuel warning symbol was now presented in 3 different orientations of stereo depth. In the intermittent condition, the fuel was flashed on and off, but it was flashed with disparity, so it would be closer towards the user. In the persistent condition, the fuel warning symbol would flash in and out of depth, but would always be on. And in the dynamic condition, it would move sinusoidally in and out towards the user. And the reason why we did those 3 different conditions, in the intermittent condition, we wanted to see the effect purely of a stereo symbology. One of the secondary effects of using a stereo symbology for a warning alert symbol is it's then continuously on. So if you see a performance benefit, is it because it's continuously on and visible, or is it because of the stereo depth? So we're trying to really pull that out. And then the reason why we did the static persistent in and out versus the dynamic is because there is some evidence that motion in depth dynamic stereo is processed differently to static stereo stimuli. And this is the setup. So we had our subjects sat in the chair, flying the simulator with the joystick, with their fingers resting on the switches on the left-hand side, and then they've got the tablet next to them to answer the symptom and workload questionnaires at the end. So there's really minimal examiner interference. And you can see the subject also linked up with temperature sensors and ECG leads as well. So let's not beat around, let's go straight to the results. So this is the mean response time to correctly identify the fuel warning symbol and dismiss it in each of the 4 conditions. And hopefully you can appreciate that they're pretty flat. There's not much difference between them. So adding stereo 3D to a warning alert symbol did not make it more unique. It did not change the response time to seeing it. And that was the same for throughput. So if you take into account accuracy divided by response time, that's our measure of throughput. And we showed that, yes, throughput decreased slightly in the intermittent condition, but there were no significant differences. Okay, so now you're asking, well, did you even create a task that was hard enough? How do you know that this task was good enough? So this is this is flying performance along the bottom, the x-axis. And this is how close the individual got to getting to the command location that we gave them. So how good was their flying performance against the throughput of correctly identifying the fuel warning alert symbol. And hopefully you can appreciate there's a positive correlation in all of the 4 conditions. So that means that those people who were better at flying also were better at the warning alert symbol task. And that makes sense. Like, the better you are at flying, the more capacity you have to see a warning alert symbol. Now, I know what you're thinking. Did you have any pilots? Did that make a difference? Well, we did have 7 participants of the 43 who self-identified as pilots. And by that, I mean they had defined as having flown an aircraft solo. And we looked at their results compared to the rest of the group, and we found no difference in performance. So we were able to analyze all of their results together. So being a pilot didn't make a difference in this task. And that was important for us because when you're doing research, we were using non-pilot subjects, but you want to create a task that is relatable to the operational environment, but it's also not so hard that people just can't do it. And then the second box, just looking, so we looked at them flying performance against individual stereo acuity, as I've already told you that we measured in detail, and we found no correlations between individual stereo acuity and performance, either flying performance or performance in the secondary task to correctly identify that fuel warning alert symbol. Okay, so it didn't affect performance. What about cognitive workload? So peripheral skin temperature is an indicator of cognitive workload. The harder you're thinking about something, what your body does is it diverts the blood away from your peripheries to your brain to get oxygen to your brain. And we showed, if you look along, x-axis is time, and we've got change in skin temperature. And again, hopefully you can appreciate that over time, in all 4 conditions, we saw a significant decrease in peripheral skin temperature. So that gives us an indication that what we were asking people to do was cognitively demanding. And anecdotally, the feedback was that as well. Each session lasted 15 minutes, and at the end of it, the participants were like, okay, yeah, whew, that was hard work. So however, if you look at the difference between the conditions, there was no significant difference. So adding stereo 3D to a warning alert symbol did not add to the cognitive burden that we were already inducing. And the similar results were seen with heart rate and heart rate variability. There was no difference between the changes we saw in those and the stereo 3D conditions compared to the 2D conditions. What about subjective measures? So we asked 5 symptom questions on ocular fatigue, both before and after each condition. And we also asked a workload questionnaire at the end of each condition based on the NASA TLX. And we found no difference between the stereo 3D conditions and the 2D conditions in ocular fatigue symptoms and perceived workload. However, when you then look at those metrics compared to individual stereo acuity, there were 3 questions in particular that those people with the very worst stereo acuity answered more positively to. So people who with the worst stereo acuity found the task, subjectively reported the task to be more physically and mentally demanding. And we can see that illustrated in these plots here. So on the x-axis is individual stereo acuity, and just to remind you, the smaller the number, the better your stereo acuity. And then on the y-axis, we have the symptom or fatigue workload scores. And in some stereo conditions, there were positive correlations. So those with the worst stereo acuity found the task more mentally and physically demanding. But that wasn't universal across 3D conditions, so it can be taken with a pinch of salt. So, summary and discussion. We found no improvement to performance or to ocular symptoms or to cognitive workload when you displayed a warning alert symbol in stereo 3D compared to 2D. Now, why is that? One of our thought processes is that stereopsis itself is inherently a slower process. So it takes longer than the 1 hertz that we were flashing our warning alert symbol. It takes longer than that to verge, accommodate, and process the stereo image. The stimulus needs to be present for longer. However, that's not so simple to just input that into a flying task, because if you change the flash rate of what is currently being used, then that could affect your operational performance in another way. So you don't want to just implement a longer stimulus time. We found some evidence that those with worse stereo acuity may find the task harder, but it's worth pointing out that those individuals with the very worst stereo acuity in this research are very much out of the, they were far worse than what we currently accept in our aircrew population. But our kind of take-home point is that stereo may not be useful to display a warning alert symbol. And this is important for future helmet-mounted display design and procurement. So I've met and spoken with helmet-mounted display manufacturers, and they've found this information useful when they're developing and trying to sell to the military the next generation of HMDs. But all is not lost. All is not lost. Stereo 3D has been shown to be beneficial, as I said in one of my earlier slides, and in an aviation relevant environment, it's been shown to improve performance in more spatial tasks, in simulated aerial refueling, and to more accurately estimate distance and altitude, particularly in helicopter environments. Or also flying through a kind of highway in the sky type image with fewer flight path deviations. What I would like to see is those experiments replicated in an HMD, because hopefully I've I've shown you that you can't just take the benefits in a stereo 3D display and put them into an HMD. They don't necessarily translate because the HMD is a completely different operating environment. You have to consider the integration factors, the see-through nature of it all. Regarding a warning alert symbol, there are other things that you could use in stereo 3D that I think are ripe for investigating as well. So the use of color, relative size, which I think would actually augment a stereo 3D image. So by popping something in and out, you also increase its size. So you're adding in the added factor that works well in the normal world as well. And frontal plane oscillation, we're more sensitive to motion in that direction. There's some evidence in the literature. Obviously, if you're displaying text with words, you have to be careful about oscillating stuff because it can be difficult to read. So some final thoughts. Just to reiterate, we did not find a performance benefit to using stereo 3D to display a warning alert symbol. And we're not suggesting any change to the vision standards based on this research. But it's highly likely that stereo will be useful in other scenarios, in other situations, in other contexts in an HMD. So it's definitely not to be dismissed entirely. And not everyone has good stereopsis. So it's really important to still test to threshold the users in research experiments. And we still advocate for more reliable digital vision test methods. And both in the UK and in the US, we are working hard to update those vision test standards. We have a paper coming out just next month in the Journal of Aerospace Medicine and Human Performance to just really shout about getting digital tests in. It costs $10 million to train a pilot to fly an F-35 aircraft, which relies on a binocular, soon to be, helmet mounted display system. So what you don't want is you've trained this guy up through, or girl, through their all the different aircraft platforms, but only when you put them in a much more visually demanding environment, come to realize that they cheated on their vision tests. So we still absolutely advocate for digital vision tests. And the one bit, if you can take home and remember anything from this presentation, is as display engineers, if you're working with stereo displays or doing research with them, then please consider testing and characterizing the stereo ability of your users. And when you're doing that, think about the test methods that you're using and the limitations of the tests to get that result. My references will be available, and I'll take any questions.